Hello, and how are you, my friends? I'm Peter, and here I'm telling you stories about the most interesting European cars of the 80s and 90s. Today we are talking about the best-selling British two-seating roadster of the 90s, the MGF. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to my channel to never miss a new video. We almost got to 1000 subscribers, let's get there together. And if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. Now let's get back to the car. The MGF was produced from 1995 to 2002 with a facelift in 1999. In 2002, basically the same car but with serious design and engineering changes received the name MGTF and was produced in Birmingham, UK until 2005 and then in Nanjing, China from 2007 to 2011. In total, about 77,000 MGFs and about 40,000 TFs were produced. That's really decent numbers for such a niche car. They were sold in the UK and in continental Europe, as well as in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and obviously China. MG wanted to sell them in the United States too, but that never happened unfortunately. The MG brand was conceived by Cecil Kimber in the second half of the 1920s as a spin-off of the British automaker Morris Garages, very popular at that time, which was owned by a highly controversial person, William Morris. Cecil Kimber, who was a skilled mechanic by that time, worked as a sales manager in the Oxford dealership of Morris and later became its general manager. The first cars with the MG badge, an abbreviation of Morris Garages, were produced as special sports version of Morris cars. They were successful and the MG Midget, which appeared in 1928, became an icon of small two-seating roadsters. The project grew up and the separate MG car company was incorporated in Abingdon, near Oxford, in July of 1930, and continued production of small, fast and very cool for that time sports cars. In 1935, William Morris sold MG to his main company, Morris Motors. It was more like formal restructuring, but Cecil Kimber lost his independence and had to leave the company in 1940 because of growing disagreements with Morris management. In 1952, Morris Motors merged with Austin. In 1966, after merging with Jaguar, it became British Motor Holdings. And in 1968, it joined the industrial monster British Leyland, which absorbed almost all mass-produced car brands in the UK. In British Leyland, the MG brand was just a small fish in a huge pond of their car brands. The production of a highly popular MGB, which was launched in 1962, was continued, but no new MG cars were actually developed. In the end, on the wave of growing economic concerns, the MG plant in Abingdon was closed in 1980 and the MG brand was abandoned. But not for long. Starting from 1982, British Leyland started using the MG logo for performance versions of various Austin Rover cars. In 1986, the brand, as a part of a newly restructured Rover Group company, was sold to British Aerospace. In 1992, the first relatively new MG car appeared on the market, and that was the MG RV8, which I have another video about. The RV8 was built on the old platform of the MGB with new design elements. It wasn't a bad car, but it was technically outdated for the 90s, expensive, and wasn't popular as a result. Many car historians, including myself, consider the RV8 a commercial failure, but there are other opinions, and I know that there are many people who love the RV8. But the engineers and designers of Rover Group for many years already worked on a completely new car, which should be a revival of an initial idea of the MGB, a small and affordable but really fun to drive roadster. And of course I mean the star of this video, the MGF. The Rover Group was sold to BMW in 1994, but that fortunately didn't change the plans, and the MGF was launched in 1995 and became very popular. During the 80s, the Rover design team several times came up with ideas of small sports cars with two seats that could continue the glorious heritage of MG Roadsters, but none of them made it further than a stage of showcase prototypes. In 1991, Rover Group started a special project called Phoenix Revival to finally create a successor of the MGB. The lead designer of the project was Stephen Harper, who worked at different times with Volvo, Rolls-Royce, Austin Rover, Ford, and Aston Martin. Stephen Harper created initial design drawings, which became a base for three very different prototypes of a new car. The first had a front engine and front-wheel drive on the chassis of the Austin Maestro. The second one was prepared by Reliant on the basis of Reliant Scimitar. It also had an engine in the front, and it was a 3.9-liter V8 engine, but it was a rear-wheel drive car. And the third one was a mid-engine rear-wheel drive car with some chassis and suspension elements of Rover Metro and the engine also from the Metro. The team built fully running prototypes of all three proposals and tested them. As a result, the mid-engine car was chosen to become the revived Phoenix because of its superior handling and weight distribution. So, after intensive engineering, finishing and design updates led by Rover's internal designer Jerry McGovern, the new MGF was released and became the first mid-engine car of MG and the first fully new MG car since 1962. The exterior look of the MGF was a very successful combination of modern design and the visual heirloom of the MGB with its specific shape of the front grille and round headlights. Of course, it was a two-door open roadster with two seats, like the MGB and MG Midgets, and this was the only available body style. The convertible top was manually operated, and it was easy to open and close it with just two latches on the windshield frame. The car was very small. It was only 391 cm or 154 inches long and 165 cm or 65 inches wide. And it was relatively light with a weight of 1100 kilos or 2400 pounds. Relatively because its direct competitors Mazda MX-5 Miata, Lotus Elan, which I have another video about, and Lotus Elise were even lighter. But the weight distribution was really great, almost 50-50 between the front and rear axle. So the handling of the MGF was really impressive. The car had an electrically assisted power steering system, which was a notable feature for a car of its class at that time. And it did its work greatly, as well as the suspension, which was also unusual. The MGF had a hydrogas suspension, which combined pre-pressured hydraulic fluid with gas displacers filled with nitrogen, used as dampers instead of coil springs. This suspension was a common feature of British Leyland cars since the 70s, and actually it was very good. It was different from the self-leveling suspension used for example in the Citroën XM, which I have another video about. The suspension of the MGF wasn't that sophisticated, but it was simpler and more reliable in the long run. From the start of the sales, the interior was rather simple, but nice. Later, at the facelift of 1999, it was upgraded and enhanced to look more modern. The next update of the interior came in 2002 together with the TF model. The MGF was positioned as an affordable car, at the same price point as the Mazda Miata, so you couldn't expect a lot of luxurious features inside. The plastic looked nice, but could feel cheap on the touch. The seats were narrow and not very comfortable for long trips, and the positions of the clutch and brake pedals raised a lot of questions. But the driving position was actually very good for drivers below 6 feet 4, as well as the visibility around the car. The scales in the instrument cluster were large and easy to read. The chip-filling plastic actually proved its long-term viability over the years. And the car was relatively safe with a standard driver's airbag and optional passenger's airbag and ABS. The lack of storage could be an issue for the everyday use of this beautiful toy, but you could expect that from a car of that size and mission. That wasn't a car where you could put all your family together with a number of suitcases. The MGF had not one but two trunk spaces in the rear and in the front, like a Tesla. But the rear trunk was small and the front one was almost non-existent, because all space was occupied by the spare wheel. And you didn't have any decent storage inside the car too. But you probably didn't need it. You had a very fun to drive car and the road. What else could you need? All MGFs used inline 4-cylinder aluminum K-series engines, widely used across the whole model line of Rover Group in the 90s. But there were several versions of those engines available. From the start of sales, the basic engine for the MGF was a 1.8-liter engine with 2 valves per cylinder that produced 120 horsepower, a top speed of 193 km or 120 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 miles per hour in 8.5 seconds. The second engine was the same size, but had 4 valves per cylinder and a very interesting variable valve control system, or VVC, allowing it to produce the most effective power in various road situations. That engine could produce 145 horsepower and accelerate the car up to 209 kilometers or 130 miles per hour with 0 to 60 in 7 seconds. Not bad at all. In 2000, a new entry-level engine was introduced. It was a 1.6-liter one with 110 horses, a top speed of 187 kilometers or 116 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 9 seconds. Slower, but still not bad. And there was a very limited number of high-performance cars, just over 2000, produced in 2001 under the name MGF Trophy. Those cars had an upgraded suspension, distinctive styling elements, and a more powerful version of the 1.8 VVC engine with 160 horny ponies, a top speed of 220 km or 138 miles per hour, and 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds. Most of the MGFs had a 5-speed manual transmission. But starting from 2001, a CVT automatic transmission called Steptronic or Step Speed in different countries was also an option. It was called so because it could mimic the switch of gears or steps, including a semi-manual switching option, which wasn't common for CVT transmissions. Only about 1000 cars with the CVT transmission were actually produced, which makes them a kind of a collectible rarity today. As you may expect, driving MGF was a very exciting and interesting experience. The car had a great suspension, virtually ideal weight distribution, a low center of gravity, and enough power for its light weight. Well, almost all small roadsters are fun to drive cars, and MG knew a lot about building small roadsters. This was one of the rare cars at the end of the 90s which still could give you a lot of pure driving experience without electronic assistance and limitations. The ABS was optional, and if you rejected it, you were one-on-one with the road and nothing could limit your possibilities, and responsibility for your mistakes, of course. But the MGF was a rather forgiving car that allowed experienced drivers to touch the limits of laws of physics and traffic regulations, but also suitable even for beginner drivers. It had very sensitive but predictable steering, so you could have fun and be safe at the same time. On a dry road, the MGF had great and reliable handling in turns. The suspension had ideal settings, so the car was sticking to the road as if it was on rails. It was trickier on a wet or icy pavement because of the mid-engine arrangement, and the car could drift unexpectedly in those road conditions. But if you didn't really push your luck in the bad weather, you would be okay. The cars with simple engines had decent acceleration, and the acceleration of the VVC cars was just great. You could rev up the engine to 7000 revs, where it showed you all its impressive capabilities. In addition, in the MGF you could feel the speed and acceleration better than in any large luxury car, because you were closer to the road and closer to the nature elements, no matter with an open or closed convertible top. It just felt more pure, better, and even faster than it actually was. Yes, the car was loud. The engine itself behind your back was loud, and the wind noise and noises from the tires also added a lot to the sound attack on your ears. But that was exactly what the buyers of such car would expect. In a luxury sedan, this would be a failure, but in a roadster, it was just a part of the game, which even made this game more funny. Of course, the MGF inevitably was compared to its predecessor MGB and its own competitors like the Mazda MX-5, which we call Miata in the US, or BMW Z3. I never heard anyone saying that the MGF was worse than the MGB. They were just cars of different ages with slightly different engineering approaches. But they both were fun to drive cars, and it seems that the MGF was a decent successor to the MGB. It's more difficult with Miata. The MGF and the Mazda MX-5 were sold at the same time to the same customers and for more or less the same price. And both were very good and interesting cars. In driving capabilities, both were more or less the same too. Miata was a little lighter, but had weaker engine in the UK at that time, so the top speed and the acceleration times were almost the same. Miata had better assembling quality, but the MGF had a more interesting mid-engine arrangement. I was surprised to learn that Miata had a little controversial image in the UK as a hairdresser's car, promising more than it actually could give you. But the MGF had a little gloomy reputation because of quality issues. So both cars had their pros and cons, and it was really difficult to choose one. The BMW Z3 was a little more expensive, but it also was fully comparable and competitive with Mazda and MG in terms of driving capabilities. Most of the reviewers gave preference to Mazda MX-5 or BMW Z3, saying that they were more interesting cars to drive than the MGF and had better quality. But the customers preferred the MGF, and it became the best-selling small roadster in the UK in the second part of the 90s. In the 2000s, the MGF and then TF also were very popular. The TF in 2002 received a more traditional coil spring suspension. It was stiffer but even more sportier and did its job very well. The sales were good, but unfortunately not good enough to save the company. In 2000, BMW sold the MG Rover Group to an English company, Phoenix Venture Holdings. They owned the brand for 5 years and launched the MG TF. But after accusations of controversial business practices, the company went into receivership in 2005 and the production of cars was stopped. The brand and rights for the cars were sold to Chinese manufacturer Nanjing Automobile Group, which relaunched the production of the MG TF in China in 2007 and continued it until 2011. The MG brand still exists, and Nanjing sells a wide range of cars in Europe. Unfortunately, they didn't have an affordable roadster anymore. The MG is going to launch a new roadster, now an electric one, under the name MG Cyberster in August 2024, with a starting price from £55,000. Let's see what will come out of it. Back to the MGF. The bright performance of the car was a little obscured in the 90s by its quality issues. The MGF was notorious for head gasket problems of the engines. The source of the issue was not the engine itself, but a thermostat. The MGF was the first mid-engine car for MG, and the engineers placed the thermostat in a bad place. It was located at the base of the engine block. So the cylinder head could overheat before enough heat was transmitted down the block to open the thermostat. And when it opened, the cold fluid could cause thermal shock, and the abrupt closing of the thermostat again, due to cold fluid from the radiator, prevented sufficient coolant from reaching the head. This led to different rates of expansion and contraction between the head and the block. In addition, the locating dowels of the head gasket were made of plastic, and they could melt because of the heat. And long coolant lines from the radiator in the front of the car to the engine in the rear were prone to rust and clogging if not maintained well. On top of all this, it was very difficult to work on the engine of the MGF because of the limited accessibility. Those issues were solvable with the relocation of the thermostat and using different head gaskets and stainless steel coolant lines. But they put a remarkable blot on the reputation of the MGF and the K-series engines. But actually, the engines themselves were reliable. Aside from the head gasket issue, they didn't have serious problems and could work for decades and hundreds of thousands of miles if maintained properly. The early MGFs also had some issues with assembling quality, but BMW changed a lot in the production and quality control processes, so the cars produced at the end of the 90s were much better made. Well, anyway, the MGF was and is a great car for its money. It could be an ideal competitor for Mazda Miata, if not for the quality issues. But in any case, it was a very funny little car that could easily put a lot of smiles on your face when you drove it. The MGF was never sold in the United States during its production. MG created that car with a target on the American market, remembering that the MGB was very popular in the US in the 70s. But allegedly, BMW didn't want to sell the MGF in America to avoid competition with their own roadster BMW Z3. But today, if you want an MGF in America, you can easily import one from the UK or continental Europe, because many of those cars are older than 25 years. In the UK, you can buy an MGF now from just 1,000 to 7,000 British pounds, depending on the mileage and condition. In continental Europe, the average asking price is from 1,600 to 12,000 euros, with rare trophy versions for 17,000–18,000 euros. You can find a lot of good running examples closer to the lower part of the range. And this is a very good deal, I believe, considering the fun for money ratio and the rarity and future collectible value of those cars. Well, thank you very much for watching. If you owned or drove an MGF or TF, please tell me about your experience and your impressions of those cars in the comments below. And if you also drove a Mazda MX-5, please tell me which car you liked more and why. Thank you so much for your stories and thoughts. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. New interesting stories are coming soon. Thank you so much, my friends, and see you next time!